You're listening to the Talking Headways podcast network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Jake Berman to talk about his book, The Lost Subways of North America. We discuss transit histories through the lens of racial dynamics, urban sprawl, streetcar monopolies, ballot measures, and overlooked cities. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super amazing and kind Patreon supporters. We appreciate you all keeping this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire going. To join this merry band of subway crayonistas and city smarties, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note sent with a cool train station stamp. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scars. And if you want to just give a single dollar a month, you'll be able to get the podcast fee with zero outside ads or podcast recommendations in Patreon. We'll leave information in the show notes about how to do it and how to get it into your podcatcher. We've also recently put up some bonus material and have weekly free posts from our newsletter intro, so check it out if you haven't already. And speaking of scarves, it's still winter, so get your heavyweight bus or bike scarves. You definitely need one for you, your friends, your colleagues, and for the anti-bust activists you just want to frustrate. If you want to get one of the bus or bike scarves or the lightweight bike scarf for hot climates, visit theoverheadwire.com or support us on Patreon. There are many other ways to support the show, including buying books from the bookshop site, either the books from the authors we interview or any book you like. bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. And find our Cars Are Cholesterol merch at bit.ly/carsarecholesterol. And for anything else, including the Town Planning and Practice audiobook that plays like a podcast, visit theoverheadwire.com. You can also get that podcast from Libby at your public library. And finally, definitely sign up for the now 20-year-old daily newsletter at theoverheadwire.com, established in 2006, and our over 100,000 item link archive tagged by topic and city. We'll leave a YouTube explainer video in the show notes for that one as well. Or you can just keep listening and enjoying the show. We appreciate that too. You can find us mostly on Blue Sky and Mastodon, sometimes on Threads, Instagram, Flickr, YouTube, Substack, and LinkedIn if you want to connect, usually at the Overhead Wire, but with Flickr, it's called Transit Nerds. We've got some great stuff coming up in our 13th year of the podcast, so keep on listening for announcements. But for now, just enjoy the show. Jake Berman, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I got stuck in traffic one too many times when I was living in Los Angeles, and it became an all-consuming obsession of mine to figure out just what happened to public transport in North America compared to, say, Europe or Japan. The particular freeway to blame is the 101 through Hollywood in Los Angeles, and I had been stuck behind a guy in a Jeep for roughly half an hour, the kind of fellow with too many bumper stickers, and I was just thinking to myself, my commute is 5 miles. What am I doing with my life? Why am I stuck behind this idiot in a traffic jam that hasn't moved for half an hour? So I went to the library and I started doing research on what happened to LA's once vaunted public transit network. And as it turned out, it wasn't just LA that had this kind of collapse of the public transit network. It was all across North America. And one thing led to another, and I started making maps of both the vanished public transit networks and what could have been had the politics come out a different way.
I mean, it's fascinating. So the first thing that popped in my head when you said you were on the highway, and I read this in the book as well, but when you're on the highway, it reminded me of like the diverging trails that you took from somebody like Elon Musk, who's like, hey, I'm sitting in this highway in traffic too, and I'm going to design this hyperloop to mess up high-speed rail. And I'm going to dig tunnels everywhere. I just find that fascinating that you had a different way of thinking about things and process for going about thinking like, why did this happen versus like the other direction that you could have gone, I guess, which is evil megalomaniac. But
I mean, it is something where I lived previously in Spain. And so I was well aware of the fact that it's possible to go from, say, Madrid to Seville faster than you can go to the airport, get on a plane, go from Madrid to Seville, and then get to the city center from the airport. Like, it was very well known to me that public infrastructure for public transport is far better abroad than it is in the States. So I was thinking to myself while stuck in the freeway, Spain is a much poorer country than the United States, right? Like my counterparts in my day job who do the exact same job make a third or half of what I make. And yet, it's much easier to get around Spain without a car than the United States. And that's really what led me down this road in the first place. The transport problem is not something that can or should really be solved with technological innovation. We should be ripping off the best ideas from other places. We should be imitating them, not innovating.
Yeah. And so you designed all the maps in the book. You got into this stuff pretty hardcore. Like, was that something you were interested in before? Like when I was a kid, I was always interested in maps and stuff. That was like kind of what led me into this whole thing. But was it just the sitting in traffic, or was it something, it was already inside of you from when you were younger?
I did play way too much SimCity when I was a kid.
It's always the SimCity. 2000?
I actually got a copy of the original SimCity somewhere in the early 90s. It was a birthday gift from, I think, one of my family friends. And then SimCity 2000, and it's been like that ever since.
That's funny. Yeah, so a bunch of my friends had that one and like Command and Conquer and a bunch of other games. And pre-Twitch, we'd just go over and like watch each other play the games and try to like build the stuff. And SimCity was one of our favorites for sure. So what did you learn from looking through all the individual histories of all these cities that you wanted to see what their transit networks were like, when they were first started versus what they are now?
I think what the most interesting takeaway for me was history tends to rhyme in different places. You would never expect places like, say, Detroit, Atlanta, and Los Angeles to have parallel trajectories with anything, right? LA is the quintessential suburban city. It's as California as you get. Atlanta is the capital of the South. Detroit is a Midwestern industrial town. And yet, when it comes to the transport question, so much of what got built and what didn't get built was based on the race question.
That's a theme that goes throughout the book. I'm curious about that too, is like how much of this is a story about race and white flight? Because a lot of the discussions kind of go into that territory. And I know from my perspective, and I wrote my master's report at the University of Texas looking at the history of light rail in Austin. And there it wasn't really a race question, but I went and looked at all these histories of these different networks like you did. And what I found was I actually dug into like the reports that are housed at Princeton, the Office of Technology Assessment, and they had done like these community planning reports for all of these systems that were being planned in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, right? So you looked at Detroit, you looked at Atlanta. And I think the one that surprised me the most, and maybe just because I was in college and I didn't know any better from a planning perspective, but Atlanta and the impact of the race discussion was so thick and so deep that, it made me think about all these other places. And your book brought that up again, which is like, how many of these places, the transportation that we have now is a result of the race question?
Yeah. And I think it really can't be separated from the end of segregation. In Los Angeles, where I used to live and where I'm really quite familiar with their battles more than any other place, the fear through most of the post-war era was that Black people would get on the train, take the train to Beverly Hills, steal people's televisions, and then speedily escape on the subway, which the whole concept is kind of ridiculous if you think of just how big TVs were back in the day, and that, yes, they sold cars to Black people as well, but it really couldn't be decoupled from that fear of public transport equals desegregation.
And the Atlanta example, I mean, they also tried to give them like an inferior product too. Instead of a rapid transit system, they're like, here, maybe we can build these busways for you into these sections of the region. And, that was a non-starter.
Yeah. And like one of the reasons that Atlanta did get what it has right now is the incipient start of Black political power within the city. One of the reasons that MARTA finally passed after several referenda is that the MARTA system got Black buy-in. Many of the east-west lines routing decisions were changed from the original plans to better serve Black neighborhoods.
I'm also interested in how much of this is a story of sprawl, too. I mean, there's white flight, but then there's also the sprawl question.
I'm not sure that it's as much a story of sprawl per se, because Canadians have sprawl too, right? If you drive out to the burbs of Montreal or Toronto, they look much the same as say, Long Island outside New York City or the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles. The difference, I think, is urban freeways specifically. In Canadian cities, they had the same suburban boom after the war, but they never decided to demolish their city centers in order to build those freeways. And that's really the reason that public transport works so much better in Canada than it does south of the border.
Because of the freeway question.
Or the lack thereof, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So they didn't build them through the center of the cities. We've talked about this a number of times on the show recently, but Megan Kimball's book is really illustrative of the discussion that Eisenhower had with some of his advisors at the time that they were talking about why a lot of the highways were going through American cities. And he was actually advised against it. And she went into the archives and found these discussions and notes from the thoughts that he had and people, the advisors around him that said, hey, you need to build transit to get people between places. The cities are too dense for running a highway through. And, you know, the interesting part, too, was when this was going on, Nixon was on the ballot against Kennedy. And so he didn't want to mess up his party's fortunes. And obviously they lost to Kennedy. But it was interesting to see how politics played into that, too. And I imagine that is a discussion that goes throughout the discussions that you have in the book, and it does.
Yeah, I think with that particular era, like basically the era between Eisenhower and Richard Nixon, the consensus was not that American cities needed to expand, grow, build out suburbs, but it's as though the powers that be decided that this was a good chance to clear out all of these slums that nobody particularly liked. And lest we get too romantic about neighborhoods that were demolished, my mother-in-law was a child at the time that she moved into one of these big X-shaped towers that were built in New York City to replace tenements in Manhattan. And her parents had gotten a 2-bedroom apartment that's 1,000 square feet, and she started crying because she thought that the entire floor would be coming into the apartment to use the bathroom, because that's how overcrowded these tenement buildings were. So it is useful to have that as a corrective, because people really like living in city centers now, but at the time, it was associated with a specific type of urban poor, and especially minority poor, whether it's Filipinos in Echo Park, Los Angeles, or Jews in Boyle Heights of LA on the other side of downtown.
So what else is interesting to you? Like, what popped out at you while you were writing this book and doing the research for it? What was the thing that stuck out to you the most?
Well, I think what stuck out to me the most is the degree to which the politics of the past don't really map on to what they look like today. One of the reasons that American cities ended up shutting down so much of their public transit networks is that the old streetcar monopolies, the red car system in Los Angeles, the Market Street Railway in San Francisco, the Detroit United Railway in Detroit, were really treated as public enemy number one during the interwar period. Much the same way that the tech oligarchs have very few friends in the public eye these days, the railway and transit oligarchs of a century ago also had very few friends. Because if you think about it, the year is 1920, and the automobile hasn't really gone mainstream just yet. So if you want to get around a city, your options are to walk, find somebody with a horse, or pay the fare of the much-hated transit monopoly. So in some sense, people like Henry Ford and Walter Chrysler represented a going away from these private monopolies that dominated the regions. So in Seattle, for instance, the streetcar monopoly was also the electric company. Same thing in Atlanta, where Georgia Power, which is still the electric monopoly, ran the trains. In other cities, the streetcar monopoly was deeply tied with something else. Like in Oakland, across the bridge from San Francisco, the owner was something called the Realty Syndicate. They built hotels and suburban subdivisions, and that's how they made their real money. They had very few friends as a result because they dominated so much of the metropolitan areas. And as part of this reaction, a lot of the country just decided to throw the baby out with the bathwater. If you are in New York or San Francisco, cities decided to open up their own transit companies to compete with the much-hated monopolies and put them out of business. If you go to Seattle or Detroit, the city just bought the thing outright and nationalized it. And in other places like Los Angeles or New Orleans, the public's decision was to grin and bear it.
You mentioned earlier that history rhymes, and it's really fascinating to see. You mentioned the tech oligarchs, but I was thinking about the taxi companies and Uber and those types of takeovers, and people think it's the best thing, the next thing, but it's not always.
Yeah. And I mean, like, there is something to be said for the new technology providing a relief from something that people did not like at all. Like, when Uber first came to New York City, it was a revelation because you could get where you wanted to go. Like, New York City, famously, yellow cabs would not go to Brooklyn. Like, if you hailed a cab, you would have to go through a whole dog and pony show in order to convince a cabbie to go over the bridge. Or you'd have to call a kind of sketchy car service and haggle with the driver to get over the bridge. Whereas Uber says, great, you put it into your phone, you say, I want to go to Brooklyn, no mess, no fuss, you know what the fare is, and you call it a day. And it's somewhat similar with the introduction of the automobile, and for that matter, the bus, where you weren't reliant on, say, the Pacific Electric Railway in Los Angeles a century ago, because there was a competitor, a publicly owned bus service owned by the city of Santa Monica, which is now the Big Blue Bus. Or alternatively, you could drive. You weren't at the mercy of the Pacific Electric, and you didn't have to spend your money propping up this corrupt monopoly.
I find it also interesting thinking about the fact that a lot of these companies like the Pacific Electric never really turned a profit. Maybe during World War II, because they were because people were forced to use it because of this. People were saving all of their resources, but it never really was something where these streetcar companies made a ton of money. They were combined with the electric company. They were combined with real estate development. They were combined with a lot of stuff. And so it was thinking about it as a public service, and that's in the end why a lot of these cities purchased the rights or the properties of these systems. But I find that fascinating as well, is that like we look back and think about, the days of the streetcar and the streetcar suburb and the neighborhoods that existed, or ownership is how we should do this and it should be run like a business, which is, a silly way of thinking about it. But I find that fascinating too, that these companies never really were on top of it. And the Twin Cities example specifically was interesting because the people that wanted a profit just basically ruined it.
Yeah, well, I think that is a major misconception about the history, where oftentimes it was the transit companies themselves that wanted to shut down streetcar service, because streetcars that don't have their own lanes, or they don't have their own dedicated right of way, they stop every couple of blocks, they run in mixed traffic, they're not really a service improvement on a bus. To make at-grade rail work, you have to run it in its own lanes, you have to run long trains, you have to do basically what looks like light rail, as opposed to the streetcars in like the F Market in San Francisco, which stops every couple of blocks.
Yeah. Yes and no. There's purposes. There's different travel markets and things like that. People still ride the F. It's not like it's, an extra thing. But you have that whole corridor, which is BART, the Muni Metro, all the lines that go down on Market Street, and the F line as well, which I will say, I admit, I ride the F every day on my way to go to my daughter's school. So maybe I'm a little jaded in that perspective.
I mean, like, look, I like the F Market, and I used to ride it a lot when I was working in San Francisco, because that was the fastest way to get from my office to the courthouse. And like, I used it, right? But there's nothing that the F Market does that requires a streetcar, as opposed to like you could do it just as well with bendy buses. But even though SF chose to build that as a tourist attraction.
Yeah, they did. And as a result of the trolley parades and the, bringing down the Embarcadero Freeway was also a part of that too.
Oh yeah, it was a great idea, don't get me wrong, especially as part of the urban revitalization that I grew up with, because I'm originally from SF. Like, things were a lot more sketch before the Embarcadero Freeway was torn down, before things really started getting cleaned up in the 90s. But at the same time, it doesn't necessarily require rail to do that.
You're right. It doesn't. I was also surprised at the density of Philadelphia's streetcar lines from the past. I was looking at those maps and I was like, it feels like there's a line on every street almost.
Yeah, Philly's system was built out by, I think it was close to 20 different streetcar companies, which ultimately fell under one monopoly, the Philadelphia Transit Co. And for various reasons, Philly ended up using streetcars for the bulk of their in-city lines. And most of those lines that really should have been upgraded to carry some sort of subway surface route, like the ones that run to West Philly, just never were.
What's interesting about Philly today, looking at those old maps?
I think it's interesting to me to see just the way that Philadelphia really used to be in competition with New York and Chicago for being one of the big three American cities. Philadelphia really does have that sort of legacy where they were, I think, number 4 and number 5 well into the 20th century. But for various reasons, they ended up getting lapped by DC and New York. And they don't necessarily get treated as in the same league as DC and New York. And I'm not sure whether that's because they just happen to be smaller than the DMV / the tri-state area, or it's because Philadelphia is between DC and New York, whereas, Boston, on the other hand, has a very different personality, right? They don't get overlooked nearly as much by, say, the national press in a way that Philly sometimes gets skipped, if the analogy holds.
Why does Boston get attention and Philly get skipped?
I think it's a combination of the fact that Boston really doesn't have any competition within New England, and the fact that so much of the American elite, for lack of a better word, goes to college at one of the many institutions in Boston, that a lot of people pass through Boston in a way that they don't pass through Philadelphia.
I guess that's right. I hadn't really been to Philadelphia until I went to a couple of conferences there for planning purposes. But it's interesting to go to a number of these different cities and see them from a planning perspective or a transportation perspective. But thinking about their history, too, is also fascinating. I've been watching The American Revolution by Ken Burns, and, all these cities on the East Coast get talked about. And what's fascinating now is to see how important they were then versus how important they are now. And then also listening to colleagues talk about places like Baltimore, where there's a lot of folks who, live in Baltimore and they're talking about housing prices, et cetera, around the country, and they might not have the same perspective. And so they feel overlooked when we start talking about superstar cities and the housing crisis and things like that. And it's a little bit different in some of these other cities like a Philadelphia or a Baltimore. So I find that discussion, interesting when we focus on these few cities. There's others that, could use a little bit of attention as well.
I think that there is something to be said for places like Philly and Baltimore being somewhat overlooked because they did end up in like some kind of post-industrial decline, the way that, say, Buffalo or Detroit did, in a way that didn't really hit, say, Boston or DC. Boston was never a major industrial center to begin with. Boston really peaked in the 1920s, and its population was largely stagnant and then began declining after the war. Whereas Philadelphia and Baltimore hit their maximum population around 1950, if memory serves, and their decline was tied very deeply with the post-industrial era. And Boston, unlike those two, had that massive educational cluster, that massive hospital cluster that, as it turns out, became a really big deal when the economy became centered around things like healthcare and high tech. Like, Philly has Penn and Temple, and Baltimore has Hopkins, but it's nothing like the cluster of Mass General, Harvard, BU, Boston College, MIT, and all of the rest of the educational institutions in Greater Boston. So it's not unfair to say that Boston is the world's largest college town, in a way that Philly and Baltimore use Penn and Hopkins as major economic engines, but they're just one among many.
Yeah. I also have a question about a lot of times these votes that happened back in the day, and how many of these cities didn't get a subway or a rapid transit system because of one vote at one point in time, and it just changed the whole trajectory of a place.
Yeah, this happens a lot, and politics is fleeting. And if you can't get your vote through on the first ballot or the second ballot, you may not get another shot at this, which in some cases, that's fine. Like, it would have been a mistake, for instance, to build out the Cleveland Downtown People Mover. The thing only ran in one direction. It didn't serve a lot of the major destinations, and it would have been a white elephant in a way that the Detroit People Mover is a white elephant. I mean, it's a cool thing to get on and ride around downtown Detroit like it's the Disneyland monorail, but it's not a useful piece of transport infrastructure. And that's very much in contrast to a place like Seattle, say, where shooting down a full-blown subway network in the 60s and 70s was a major mistake because Seattle is well suited for public transit. And if they had received something like BART or the Washington Metro 40 years before they actually built the Link Light Rail, that would have greatly influenced the trajectory of Seattle. But Seattle in the 1970s was in deep trouble because of Boeing being in deep financial trouble, and it hadn't really become the fashionable tech hub that it would ultimately become because of, Amazon and Microsoft and the like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's just fascinating because I know that there's a lot of times in history, and even here in the Bay Area, where you voted for something or something I voted for and it never happened. And so it changed, the direction of things. Or, for example, with BART, you only built a part of a system, because some of the counties decided that they didn't vote for it. So
Actually, to go over my favorite missed opportunity, in 1912, the Bay Area ran a consolidation vote to merge the inner ring counties into the city of Greater San Francisco, the way that the 5 boroughs of New York eventually merged into one municipality. It was voted down because Oakland thought that it was going to lap San Francisco because Oakland was growing rapidly. San Francisco was still suffering the after effects of the earthquake. And so Oakland said, no, we're going to beat SF at its own game. We don't need them. And so Oakland is going to stay independent. And that bet never really paid off, but it is a fascinating thing to think of had the Bay Area decided to merge together instead of becoming, I think it's 101 municipalities theoretically making up one metropolitan area.
Yeah, basically the 9-county Bay Area and all the 29 transit agencies and all that stuff. I mean, it's funny when people talk about the transit agencies as well, like, if you talk about regional connections you could make, there's always a discussion about, whether one of the agencies is going to get short shrift because, transit in San Francisco is going to get more resources than, say, AC Transit or down in San Jose. And so it's interesting. We're still having that discussion because we're going to have that sales tax. And, the folks down in the southern end of the region weren't quite sure if they were going to sign on because they didn't want to get short shrift of the money that might come from the funding that might happen if we pass the measure. So it's interesting to see those discussions. They start then and they continue, feels like forever and endlessly.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where the really stupid turf wars in American transit just need to end. And there are plenty of ways to fix it so that the agencies don't get into these turf wars. Like, the classical way to do it is just to create one agency and merge all the others in, which is what they did in the past. But there's actually something I find fascinating in the German-speaking lands called the Verkehrsbund, where there's a regional governance board that sets fares and controls the ticketing and coordinates the scheduling between different agencies so that you can have a free transfer between, say, the Slovak railways to Bratislava and the subway within the city of Vienna. But it doesn't necessarily require one giant agency to run everything like, say, the New York MTA. You just need to have a coordination body that makes sure that everyone gets along.
Yeah. Yeah, we did a whole episode on Verkehrsverbund a number of years ago with Ralph Fuller of Virginia Tech, who's been studying this a long time. And it's a really fascinating system. The other thing is the Great Depression, right? And that impacted a lot of places as well. Just folks that were impacted, whether that was money or the politics or, whatever else, the change in the streetcar companies, et cetera. That was another fascinating turning point.
Yeah, and I think that there was really a point either during the Great Depression or immediately after the Second World War when there could have been a major public infrastructure push to say, we're not going to abandon all of these trolley lines. We're going to upgrade them and make them work, where the public just didn't buy it. The public had no patience for that kind of thing. There was a city council vote in Los Angeles in 1948 where the Pacific Electric offered to sell the remnants of the system, which was still extremely extensive, to the city of Los Angeles, and the city would run all of the remaining lines, upgraded with a subway through downtown, which would look an awful lot like modern light rail.
Yeah, it did. I saw that map and I was like, well, that looks kind of what they did.
Yeah.
For billions of dollars and years later, right?
Right, exactly. And the public just wanted nothing to do with any of this because they still considered the Pacific Electric to be this awful monopoly that nobody liked, the same way that talking about MySpace is not going to get a whole lot of people's nostalgia going.
No, for sure. And they didn't end up sitting in that traffic for too long like you did until many years later, maybe, or feel that way anyways.
Yeah, I think it's more a question of feeling that way as opposed to traffic actually happening.
Yeah.
Because Los Angeles would open a freeway and then it would reach its design capacity immediately because there was such demand for cars and for people wanting to get around in LA. Like, LA had the highest car ownership rates in America in the 1920s. And to us, a ratio of one car per four people is surprisingly low, right? That's the rate of car ownership that they have in Manhattan today. But at the time, that was considered the wave of the future.
Aside from LA, what was your favorite city to cover in this book?
My favorite story to tell was Minneapolis. My favorite city that I unexpectedly enjoyed was Cincinnati. Cincinnati is not a city that I thought would be on my list of, oh, this place is surprisingly cool. Like, I would totally go back there because I spent time in each city doing the research over quarantine after I got my vaccine. And so I had a lot of time to just wander around and take in the aura of all of these places. Cincinnati, I liked much more than I expected. Houston, I liked much more than I expected.
What did you expect out of Houston?
I'm
asking you this as a Houstonian.
Right. I basically expected a lot of suburban hell, and there is a lot of that in Houston, but inside the 610 loop, it's not that. It's an honest-to-God city, and their land use policy is remarkably good considering that the city was built out, for the most part, after the Second World War.
Yeah.
Just as a place that feels effortlessly cool and doesn't try to front, unlike, say, Dallas, where I did not particularly enjoy it. And the vibe of Dallas was much more a place that's trying to chase Los Angeles or New York or whatever it is. It's trying to follow whatever the cool trends are, as opposed to Houston, where Houston is quite happy being Houston.
I mean, I'm quite happy being a Houstonian, although I don't know if I'd live there again just for the heat.
No,
the heat is the first reason.
Oh, yeah, it's gross.
I'm so hot all the time when I was living there. Yeah, it's fascinating, like, that you gravitated towards Cincinnati because it was that Great Depression story, right? And the subway that they built but never used. And there's still talk about it, whether they should use that piece of infrastructure that they built so long ago.
Yeah, with Cincinnati, I'm less bullish on building a subway there, mostly because the metropolitan area isn't really growing. And the metropolitan infrastructure is relatively overbuilt as it is. So it's hard to justify that level of commitment to new public infrastructure when you could get a lot better value for money by building a bunch of protected bus lanes.
If you could go back in time and change one of the results of the systems that you looked at, which one would it be?
Actually, I would go back to the Interstate Highway Act and ban construction of freeways through city centers. That's the single largest reason why American cities don't work today compared to, say, Madrid, where, yeah, of course they have freeways, but the M30 runs around the center of Madrid. The M25 in London runs around the center of London. Nobody decided in London that it would be a good idea to run a freeway in front of Westminster Abbey. It's not a thing that they should be doing. And in American cities, they said, yeah, of course it's a great idea. Let's build a freeway down the Embarcadero in San Francisco, or let's build I-10 right through the edge of the French Quarter in New Orleans. They thought it was a good idea at the time because it was the wave of the future, and it was a way to get rid of poor people, minorities, and poor minorities.
It's fascinating if you look back at the history of places like London and Paris. You have all these stations that end on the periphery. Even then, they didn't try to go through town until they built the subways underneath, right? All the Gare du Nord and a lot of the stations in London. I mean, they were outside of the city center.
Yeah, and I think something that has to do with that is that London and Paris have a lot invested by the powers that be in being in the city center in a way that American elites were much more willing to get out of the city.
Mm-hmm.
So, like San Francisco, for instance, has always had a cluster of very rich people on Nob Hill. New York has the Upper East and Upper West sides. And the powers that be of those cities are deeply invested in real estate locally in a way that in a lot of other places, it just made sense to decamp for the burbs.
What lessons did you learn that planners should take with them when they read this book?
The biggest lesson that I want planners to take from this is to think about the ways that we got stuff done in the past. By and large, a lot of the public input and bureaucracy that characterizes modern American planning is not particularly useful for anything or anybody. It's a sort of kabuki theater where the same three cranks claiming to speak for the people show up and say, no, we couldn't possibly have bus lanes on Geary Boulevard, for instance.
Yep.
And this is not the actual will of the people because the people already had a say in this when they had an election. There is no better way to have a community consultation than to just have an election. And politicians should be able to enact their agendas. It shouldn't have to require a million years to build, say, the Chinatown subway or the Second Avenue subway or the Wilshire Boulevard subway, because these are things that the public decided to tax themselves for. They elected politicians to get this stuff done. Well, yes, the politicians should be able to get stuff done as opposed to getting bogged down in the details with this type of endless procedure that goes nowhere.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that, I often think about that, the representatives that we elect and whether they are able to move forward things. You see stuff here in San Francisco specifically about, the Great Highway and, Sunset Dunes, the new park, and the recall of Joel Engardio. He actually saw what the result of the election was, which is the whole city of San Francisco said, we want to have this park. And so it happened. And so I think there's a lot of people that just don't like the results of elections. And so they'll push back on that. But it's also frustrating that we can't just build a lot of these, systems that we really want. The other frustrating thing is that, in the United States specifically, we talk about this all the time, but if we're going to have votes on transit systems like these, why don't we have votes on highways and roads? Like, why did we ever allow the state DOTs to be the ones that are the arbiters of, picking where the routes were? Well, we decided that was something that we wanted. And so nobody's really pushed back on it. And so it's interesting to look at it from that juxtaposition of we vote for transit systems, we don't vote for roads.
Yeah, but that part is more complicated just because so much of the state highway systems predate the reconstruction of transit in the US. And congestion is not really a political issue in the sense of left versus right in the states. There are questions of how do we deal with congestion, but it hasn't really become politicized in the way that, if you want to build a subway in Los Angeles, well, then black people will come to Beverly Hills and steal your television. Highways never got politicized in that sort of way. And I suspect it's because so much of the experience of people's daily lives is spent in a car.
I mean, yes and no. They're still building highways through people's, they're still tearing up neighborhoods. There's a Bakersfield highway that just opened up. They didn't have to vote for that. That tore down whole neighborhoods already. There's going to be one that they're trying to build in the state to run through a place that's going to be inundated with floodwaters in a number of years.
You mean Route 37?
Route 37.
Yeah.
Stuff like that.
Yeah, no, that thing is a huge waste of money. And I'm not sure whether the answer is to have it up for a vote per se.
I mean, I don't think it should. I'm frustrated less with putting highways up for vote and more with having to put systems up to vote when that doesn't have to happen for these road systems that we've built. They're infrastructure projects. They were done by state DOTs, and state DOTs now have this infrastructure where they can go and do a lot of stuff. California High Speed Rail is taking forever. I sometimes wonder if we just gave it to the state DOT and said, build a road there, they would have had it done by now, right?
Yeah, although I think this is a California-specific problem as well, because in the Northeast, these types of referendums just don't happen. Like, there was never a referendum to do, say, congestion pricing in New York City. Neither was there a referendum to build the Second Avenue subway. It was politicians making backroom deals, but that's what politicians do.
Yeah. Final question. Where can folks find the book?
It is available wherever books are sold, but if you buy a copy from me at lostsubways.com, I will send you a signed copy.
Nice. That's the best. And then where can people find you if you wish to be found?
I'm on Blue Sky at lostsubways.com and on Reddit at r/lostsubways.
Awesome. Well, Jake, thanks for joining us. Really appreciate your time.
It was a pleasure.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of the Overhead Wire and appears first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters who support this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. You can support the show as always by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Sign up for our almost 20-year-old newsletter as well by visiting theoverheadwire.com or check out the show notes for merch or other opportunities to connect. Follow along using your podcatcher of choice, but if you can't find it there, you can always find it at its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways. Hey everybody, thanks for listening this far past the credits. If you're here, I just want to say thank you to all of our generous Patreon supporters, especially those in our $10 Dallas tier and above. I just want to share their names, first names only, of course. But I figured this is long overdue that I let folks know that their support is much appreciative. Obviously, all the tiers are very appreciative, but this group has gone above and beyond over the years, and I really appreciate that. Andrew, Ben, Derek, Gabrielle, Glenn, Greg, James, Jeremy, Jim, Joseph, Catherine, Mao, Marcus, Matthew, Mike, Nicholas, Oliver, Steve, Abraham, Abby, Ed, and Matthew. We really appreciate you, and just can't say enough about how much the support from you all and everybody else on Patreon has really helped us out. So I just wanted to say a quick thank you to everybody, and yeah, so we'll see you next time.